11th chapter of the book of John. John chapter 11. Stuart and I did not have any conversation about what I was preaching on tonight, but that was perfect. So appreciate him choosing that. Julie asked, she said, "Did y'all talk about this?" And I said, "No," but it happens that way sometimes. So I do appreciate him leading that song, "I Believe in Jesus." Tonight we're going to start our lesson talking about two women, but really one in particular that definitely believed in Jesus. And that is Mary and Martha. In John chapter 11, the two sisters of Lazarus, who is the subject of focus in this chapter because he has passed away. And this is a very familiar story of where Jesus comes and he raises him from the dead. To give you a little bit of backdrop on this story there in John chapter 11, now we're going to read, our lesson tonight is going to come primarily from verses 38 through 44, so you may want to kind of skim on down there to John chapter 11, verse 38 through 44. But I want to back up to the first part of chapter 11 and just give you a little bit of rundown of what's taking place here. I know this is a familiar passage, but one that it would definitely do us good to review just a little bit. But without going into just a whole bunch of detail, by the time that Jesus receives word that Lazarus is sick, it's almost too far gone. Not that it's too far gone for Christ, but by the time Jesus hears it, Lazarus is pretty much at the point of death. What's ironic about this whole story is that it seems to be that when you do the time frame and the timetable, it seems that he's about a 2 days journey away. But for whatever reason, that probably is another lesson in and of itself. For whatever reason, though, Jesus delays 2 days before he goes. Now, we know that he loved everyone, obviously, and still does, but there was some kind of special connection between he and Lazarus and Mary and Martha. It was that Mary who had anointed him. John tells us that in John chapter 11. So there was just a lot of special connections there between these three. But for whatever reason, Jesus delays about 2 days. He has some conversation with the disciples there. He said that he was, only sleeping and he was going to wake him, and they thought that he meant, well, he's sick, but he's going to get better. Jesus was really alluding to the fact that he knew that he either was going to or already had passed away and that he was going to raise him from the dead. But Thomas and the others, they didn't realize that and didn't understand what he was saying at the time. But when he finally got ready to go, he got there, and Martha met him first, and she said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Just like Stuart led us in that song just now, she believed in the one they called Jesus, and she knew that he had the power to heal her brother. What's amazing about that is that he talks about the fact that he is the life and the resurrection. She didn't really fully comprehend that at that point, but that's what he told her. And then as we go on, we get a little bit closer to the tomb. And of course, we read the very familiar passage here where it very simply says, when Jesus saw her emotion, when he saw all the emotions of these people, it said very simply that Jesus wept. It said in another account here that he groaned within himself. But when it got a little bit closer to time, we found it revealed there that it had been 4 days now, that Lazarus has been gone. From that, we have the story in John chapter 11 and in verse 38. There are so many lessons. I went through chapter 11 one time and I forgot how many lessons I got from it. There are so many points, so many parallels, so many lessons you can make from this. But we're going to focus on one quote tonight from Jesus that's found starting there in John chapter 11, verse 38. Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, and this is our lesson, "Take away the stone." Take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days." So if our timing's right, about the time that he was told that Lazarus was sick, he died about the same time, because he delayed 2 days, and then he went there. So now we're 4 days. So he had died pretty quick in conjunction with that time there. But you go down into verse 40, and it said, he said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God?" And then took away the stone from the place where the dead man was laying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And when he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave cloths, his face was wrapped with cloth, Jesus said to him, loose him and let him go. Powerful stuff. But I want to make this point to you as we begin the lesson tonight. I have to agree with Martha. I'm not saying she was right, and we're going to point out maybe some flaws in that tonight. But I have to say that I agree with her on her emotions and on her feelings, because I probably would have been the same way. Yes, I believe in Jesus. Martha probably much more than I, maybe, because she'd been with him. I don't know. But she definitely knew that he had the power to change things, and she even went as far to say, as her sister did, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then he tells her, when he gets there, after he's been dead for 4 days, she says, Lord, there is a stench. She was uneasy about Jesus' request. She wanted comfort. I mean, she did want that. But she was still, even at that, she was uneasy about what he had said. Really, when you think about it, she didn't want to be further disturbed. And what I mean by that is, she's already dealing with the loss of her brother. And I hate to be very graphic here, but she didn't want to smell his death as well. Fair enough? What's ironic about this story is that one reason of many that I believe Jesus arose on the third day, obviously a lot of other things were involved, but the reason that he rose on the third day, at least in part, was according to the Jewish custom and traditions that you would literally consider somebody, I guess you might say, legally deceased upon day 3. Apparently, when you study the history of that, there were some times where people at day 1, 2, and maybe 2.5 came back to life. Everybody assumed they were dead, and they were not. So I've always put it in this way. At day 3, they were good and dead. Okay? For lack of better words. Lazarus, day 4. Nobody has any doubt that he is dead. And furthermore than that, they're saying by this time, because of a lack of a mortician in the way that we have it today, of embalming things in the way that we have today, Lazarus' body is already begin to decay. Martha is disturbed. She's upset. She's lost her brother. And now Jesus says, roll away the stone. Lord, that's going to make the whole thing even worse. Why? You see why she's saying that? You see where she's coming from? But I want to tell you something that I take from this. We often want, and we touched on it in class a little bit this morning, kind of like Moses. It had to be good to Moses to hear all the things that God was aware of and understood about Israel and their suffering and wanting to help them. And Moses was, I believe, all about that until the Lord said, Moses, I want you to go to Egypt. And he started making excuses. And I think a lot of times that's how we are. Maybe we're like Martha. We're all about the comfort of Christ. We're all about the assurance. We're all about leaning on Him and everything that He has to offer. But sometimes when it really gets down to crunch time and we realize what the Lord expects of us, then sometimes we're not so keen on the feelings we have. And I believe what you find here in this story is that so many times we quickly shy away from that which He requires of us. Which leads me really to the point of the lesson tonight. Why did Jesus ask her to take away the stone? Could He not have rolled that stone away Himself? Could He not have just said a word and the stone just disappeared? Could He have not made Lazarus come walking out of the stone? He could have done a number of different things. Why in this world would He ask her to do something that He could have easily done Himself? Isn't that amazing? But I think that's the lesson for us tonight. He required them to do what they could. Number 1, to believe, and number 2, to act on that belief. And we see in the context of this story that that's what they did. And I think that's something that you and I need to take to heart as well. There is nothing that our God cannot do. But there are things that He expects us to do. And I'm afraid a lot of times we never see what He can do because we're not willing to do what we should. That's what this lesson is about tonight. I want to talk about a series of people here, and we're not going to turn and read all these stories, but we're going to talk about a series of people who simply did what God asked. And again, He could have done it Himself, but why? Why take away the stone? Let's think about that tonight. To begin with, God never does for man what He can do for Himself. There's a lot of reasons why I believe that's true. There's a lot of scriptures that we could look at. But we're going to look at just some examples tonight, and then we're going to just make one quick point from that. But I think it's safe to say, based on this story, that God never does for man, God never does for us what we can do for ourselves. I didn't say He doesn't help us. I didn't say that sometimes He does things that maybe we could do. But when it gets right down to it, He expects something on our end. And I've always said we could give God our very best, 110% day in and day out, and we never catch up with what He's already done for us, not to mention what He will do. But God is not going to do for us what we can do for ourselves. I'll give you a few examples. In Genesis chapter 6, salvation came for 8 souls, the animals, the birds, and the creatures that God wanted to be saved away from that flood. God could have created an ark and just made it appear right there in front of Noah and said, Noah, I want you to get on that thing and let's get all these animals here as quickly as we can because I'm about to wipe out this evil world. But rather than doing that, God said to Noah in Genesis chapter 6, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. That's a very simple statement, and a lot of times we hit that statement and then immediately our focus goes to, okay, well, what was gopher wood? What was pitch? What was the size of it? What was the dimensions of it? What made it float? How long did it take him? Where did he get a saw? How did he cut down all those trees? Our mind just goes wild thinking about all the ways and things that was involved in that. And that's good. That's what Bible study is all about. We should think about that. But the very simple statement that we so many times overlook is that God said to him, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Could God not have done that Himself? Sure. But He required Noah, He required man to help out in that process as well. I find that interesting. Same way as taking away the stone. Why did He ask? Secondly, another story there in Exodus chapter 3. We talked about Moses this morning in class. In Exodus chapter 3, and I mentioned this just a moment ago as well, when He told Moses that He said, I'm going to send you, and you are going to bring, by your hand, you're going to bring Israel out of the land of Egypt. He said to him, I will send you that you may bring them out. You're going to have a staff. You're going to do some miracles. You're going to perform some signs. You're going to perform some wonders. You're going to lift up your rod, and you're going to stretch out your hand, and you're going to do all these different things, but you are the one that's going to go do that. Why did He need Moses to do that? Could He not have just by His Spirit just showed up one day, froze Pharaoh and all the Egyptians literally in place? I mean, God makes the sun stand still. Couldn't He freeze somebody? He could have just froze them in mid-stride and said, all right, Israel, let's go. And He could have led them out by His Spirit. He led them by a cloud by day and a fire by night. He could have done that and said, we're going to go now let's go. But He sent Moses to do something that He could do Himself. Why? Exodus chapter 14, the same thing as He's bringing them out. He says, lift up your rod and stretch out your hand. And the sea parted. The sea parted. They came through on dry ground. When they were through, the sea came back together and drowned all those Egyptians. Amazing story. Why Moses' rod? Why did He need a rod anyway? He told him from the very beginning, you're going to take this rod with you, so why a rod? I've heard some pretty interesting lessons about things that are involved around that rod. Why the rod? Why the stick? At the end of the day, the rod was a stick, it was a piece of wood. Why did He need that? Why hold it up? Could God not have just parted it right there? Sure He could. But He asked Moses to take part in that. I'll tell you another good one, Naaman. Elisha said to him, that you need to go dip 7 times in the river Jordan and you'll be cleared. Remember, he was a Syrian commander. He was a pretty highfalutin, card-toting, literally authoritative figure. And yet, here is this man of God who says, go dip 7 times in the river Jordan. And Naaman had a point here. Now, I'm not saying he's right in it, but he had a point, and this is kind of the point we've been making. He said, shall he not just come out to me, speaking of Elisha, shall he not just come out to me? Now remember, he's commander of the Syrian army. He's a big-time dude. He's special, better than other people. Can he not just come out to me and wave his hand over me and make my leprosy go away? Sure, he could. He had a point, didn't he? He knew that there was the power there to do that. So he's reasoning through his stubborn mind, why don't he just do that? Why do I need to go dip 7 times in the river Jordan? And why Jordan? What about the Abana and the Pharpar and the Damascus, all these other bodies of water? Why not those bodies of water rather than the River Jordan? I mean, what's so special about the River Jordan? Could God not have healed him of his leprosy by other means? Sure. Another interesting story, John chapter 9 and verse 7. Talking about the blind man. There was a very interesting story that unfolded from all of this. It was mentioned a little bit this morning as well. But the story there where Jesus made with saliva and with dirt, made a salve, basically he made mud. If you really get right down to it. He made mud and he put on this blind man's eyes and he said, "Now you want you to go wash in the pool of Siloam." I want to say one thing. Dirt didn't mean anything. Saliva didn't mean anything. There was not some spiritual magical potion in that. I've always found that to be unique. I've read some interesting things on maybe what that could have done, but at the end of the day, it was because he came into contact with Jesus. And he could have healed him right there. Why did he say go dip in the pool of Siloam? Could he not have healed him on the spot? Why require something of that guy? What about Peter and those others that night in Luke chapter 5? When they had fished all night, not caught anything. Some days they just don't bite. So I told Ryan yesterday. He was down doing some fishing at the pond, and he yelled up there, "Daddy, I'm just not catching anything." I said, "Son, it's too hot." "Well, why does that matter?" I was like, "Well, they don't feel like eating. They're not going to bite today. It's too hot. They've got better sense than we do. They're down where it's cool. We're out here sweating. They're not biting today." That's just the way it is sometimes. And that's the way it was for whatever reason that night with those nets and trying to catch those fish. They just weren't cooperating. And then here comes Jesus and he says, "Well, have you caught anything?" And they said, "Well, no, we haven't caught anything." He said, "Well, launch out and let out your nets." It didn't make much sense for a son of a carpenter to be telling a fisherman by trade how to fish. But yet Peter said, "Well, at your will, I'll let down the nets." Could Jesus not have made those fish jump in the boat with him? Sure. But he told Peter and the others to launch out and try it again. See, the point's pretty simple. In all these examples, God, Jesus, they would not do what man could do for himself. Again, I did not say that they did not help them do what man could do, but they wouldn't just do everything in these stories when they very well could have. And I think that begs the story and the lesson to us that the Lord expects some effort on our part. And no, we'll never measure up to Him. We'll never even up with Him. We'll never match up with Him. But God does expect some effort on our part. And yes, they definitely helped and gave aid to doing whatever they were asked to do. So we're not alone in doing what we need to do, but I think a lesson we can take from this is God never does what man can do for himself. Here's the other side of that. God will always do what we cannot. You believe that? I think if you're honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, we look at things in our lives and we see numerous things that we could have never done on our own accord. It had to be the sheer power of God. Think about it. Did Noah preserve the life of his own accord? Did Noah save his family's life? Did Noah make all those animals 2 by 2 to walk on the ark? Did he get those birds there? I mean, he had a hand in it. But at the end of the day, God helped when Noah built. And what's interesting about it, when you look there in Genesis chapter 7, and in verse 16, it says, after Noah and his family and all the creatures were on the ark, it says, God shut the door. Notice it didn't even shut the door behind him. Isn't that amazing? It was God who sealed that door. It was God who preserved their life. Did Noah have a hand in it? Absolutely. He dedicated a big majority of his life to it. But God saved them. Noah didn't. Noah was just an assist, if you will, to what God was already doing. What about Moses? Did Moses bring the plagues on the Egyptians? No. He was a part of it. Did he bring the signs and the wonders? And did he open up the sea and close the sea? Did he put magic in that bronze serpent later on that Israel was required to look upon? No, he didn't do any of that. But this is what happened. God worked when Moses obeyed. God worked when the people looked. God worked when they quit complaining. God worked when they obeyed what He asked them to do. Same stands true for us today. What about Elisha? Elisha received a double portion of what Elijah had. Very powerful individual. But even that power came from God. And what about the Jordan? Did it come from some hot springs of minerals and healing powers? No. When you look at some of the pictures of the Jordan, if you ever know there to visit that, in many places, we wouldn't even call the Jordan around here. We wouldn't call it a river. We'd call it a creek. We'd call it a branch. It's not even that deep in some places. It's not that impressive. So what was so special about the River Jordan? Well, it's not the water. It was not the healing waters of Jordan no more. It's the healing waters of O'Neill behind me in this baptistry. It's just water. It may be tap water from Limestone County, but it's, at the end of the day, it's just water. And God made the water too, by the way. So what healed Naaman? It was God. Because he got out of the way, finally. He got his pride out of the way. He got his stubbornness out of the way. And he went and did, even though reluctantly, he went and did what God, through Elisha, told him to do. That's why he was healed. What about the pool of Siloam? Again, it's water. Was it some kind of healing things there? No. But it concluded what Jesus has already started when He told him to go to the pool and be washed. That pool of Siloam wasn't any more special than any other place. It was just simply the fact that he did what he was told. Peter and the others, same thing. Could it just be happenstance that, maybe they had fished all night and the fish were down below it just looking at their nets, laughing at them, and they thought, these guys are gone, so they slip out there one more time and throw their nets, and the fish are just caught. They caught them because they weren't paying attention. You think that happened? You think they outsmarted the fish? I doubt it. Pretty smart creatures. If they hadn't caught them all night, why are they going to catch them now? No, it was not Peter and the others. It was God. It was Christ in particular who caught those fish when they launched out and when they let down their nets. That's why the fish were caught. So here's what I want us to understand from the second point. There is never a limit to God's power in the fact of what God can and cannot do. God can do anything. But the only time at which God's power is limited is when you and I fail to do what we've been asked to do. That's the only hitch in the whole thing. And so many times we don't fully benefit from the power of God because for whatever reason we're doing something else or not doing what we need to be doing. The only limit to God's power is when we don't obey as we should. God has provided what we can. God has furnished a sacrifice. Because of our sin, we have dug such a hole in our lives and such a hole in our spiritual beings that you and I can never dig our way out of that. You ever thought about that? Having a conversation with somebody just yesterday that, sooner or later, somewhere along the way in life, you have to realize that it was your sin and my sin, not just everybody's, but a more close personal thing. It was my sin. At some point you had to admit, it's my sin that put Christ on the cross. And when you start realizing that it was your sin and all the things that you have done and said and not done and have been guilty of and so on, then you start realizing the gravity of the fact that Jesus had to die on that cross for you and for me. He died not just for everybody's sins, He died for my sins. And because of that, we're in a mess because of our sin. You go back to the Garden of Eden, we talked about it last week in the lesson on modesty. Adam and Eve realized they had messed up. And they did the best they could to kind of cover it up and deal with it. But we talked about last week, they did a horrible job at even covering up part. We can't cover it up. We can't hide it. We can't just make it go away. You and I cannot furnish a sacrifice that is good enough to eliminate our sin. Even the priests of old could not do that. Well, they might have been able to roll it forward, but they couldn't erase it. Blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of heifer could not do that. but Christ's blood can. It did, and it does, and it will always do that because it continually flows for us. And that's what it says in Romans chapter 5 and verse 6, when we were still without strength in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. In other words, when we're in a situation when we couldn't do anything about it because we didn't have enough strength to do anything about it, God sent His Son, as it says in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 9, with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, He sent Him to fix our mess. That's what He did. Because you and I couldn't fix it ourselves. Isn't that amazing? And furthermore than that, even if we were to try to somehow fix our sin, which we'll never be able to, what would we do beyond this life anyway? Let's just say that we were perfect. We're not, but let's just say that somehow we wormed our way through this life and we kind of made things okay. Even at that, we still couldn't do anything about what's after this. And somebody might argue, well, there's no after this if there's not sin, because we would have, like Adam and Eve, without sin, we'd have lived on forever. And that's a valid point. But what I'm saying is, even if we were able to fix the problems here in this life, we're still mortals. Eventually we die. So what do we do then? I've often wondered how people make it through life only thinking that we're just here for a time and then we die and then we just cease to exist. I don't understand the point of life if that's all there is to it. So when you start thinking about the next life, when you start thinking about life after this life, what about that? Well, you and I don't have any control over that, do we? But yet Jesus says, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. And in verse 6 of John chapter 14, He says, I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And what did He say at the end of verse 2? I go. Not you go. I go. Because you can't do that. Isn't that something? We can't do anything about that. And you know what? He doesn't expect us to, because He knows that we can. Just as much as we cannot provide our home in heaven, we cannot offer a sacrifice that will clear our sins. God did what we cannot do for you and for me. We need to count our blessings every day because of that. So to non-Christians tonight, I don't know where you may be. I don't know what may be going through your mind. I know some of you are not Christians here tonight. There may be something standing between you and becoming a Christian. Maybe it's unbelief. Maybe it's impenitence. Maybe it's denial. Maybe it's just the sheer disobedience. It might be something else. But here's the point. Whatever is standing between you and obeying God and being saved tonight is a stone that sooner or later you're going to have to be willing to roll out of the way. Well, Jesus will help you. Maybe you just need to take the first step and place your hands on that stone and start pushing. And it's amazing how quickly He'll swoop in and that stone will be gone. If you're not a Christian tonight and you've been putting that off, you need to stop doing that. Time is fragile. Life is as a vapor. And we don't need to waste time. Same goes for all of us who are Christians. Sometimes we have stones that develop in our life as well. Stones that keep us from being what God wants us to be. Stones of indifference. Stones of being lukewarm. Maybe it's ignorance because we don't read and study enough. Maybe it's worldliness. Maybe it's carnality. Maybe it's our pride. Maybe, and Chris, we've talked about this a lot in class when it comes to sin. You know really what's at the root of sin other than the love of money? It's selfishness. Maybe it's selfishness. You see, there's a lot of stones that can stand between a child of God and having the relationship with God that we need to have, but whatever that is, it needs to go. And you need to start today trying to roll that away. And He'll help you finish. But at the end of the day, whatever that stone may be, it's got to be removed. Because Lazarus lay dead until the stone was removed. And once it was removed, once the stone had been taken away, it was then that Jesus worked His power. Now, we've already established this, but to just kind of reiterate what we've already said, salvation and God's help are conditional based on the fact that we act upon the belief that we have. And God will take the rest. But I want to say this. I want to look at one more verse, and then I'll close with this. Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. I have heard people say before, in regards to this subject, it seems a little bit unfair It seems a little bit one-sided that if God could just help us, then why wouldn't He just do it? I've actually heard somebody say that before and suggest that before. Well, just in case that we don't get confused and think, well, it's unfair that God would expect us to do something that He could do anyways, let's look over to Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8 and 9, because Christ set a pattern for us. Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 8. It says, though He, speaking of Christ, though He was a son, yet He learned obedience by the things which He suffered. And having been perfected, He became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey Him. Let me make a real quick point for you, and the lesson will be yours. When Jesus was about to be betrayed in the garden with a kiss from Judas, what did He pray? Essentially, He prayed, Father, let's remove this stone. What did He say? He said, Father, if there is another cup, if there's another way, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. You know what Christ said? Essentially, He's saying, there's a stone that I dread. And I know you can roll it away. I know that there could be another way. If you willed it, there would be another way. But Jesus said, no matter what, I want your will to be done. And what happened? Well, God didn't remove the cup. Jesus still had to, figuratively as we're looking at tonight, He still had to roll the stone away. He had to carry the load. He had to do all of that for you and I. But God sent an angel and strengthened him. And He never looked back after that. No, God will not do for us what we can do for ourselves, but He'll sure give us the strength to do it when He sees that we're willing. Maybe tonight, you need to roll away the stone. And when God sees that you're ready to do that, I believe we have an innumerable host of divine powers in our favor that will help us do that. Roll away the stone. Whatever it is, let's get it gone. And our life will be much better because of it. Appreciate your attention tonight. If you're not a Christian, we hope that you'll become one. We've already addressed some stones that may be in your life. Maybe tonight you need to overcome those and become a Christian and be baptized. If you are a Christian, you're strayed away, you've been struggling, maybe that stone has come between you and God. Roll away the stone. Good things happen when God sees effort on our part. For your subject of the Lord's invitation, won't you come while we stand, while we sing?